Hello and welcome back to Hacking Pro Tips. Today I have the honor of sitting down with perhaps the foremost gentleman in bug bounties, Johnny Nipper. If you're not familiar with Johnny's work, I was actually surprised Johnny did his review. I didn't actually really recognize his stats, but Johnny, you've exploded to 121 bugs on HackerOne with that's across 63 programs, which is super impressive. And so with that, your signal is up in the 96th percentile, as well as impact at the 93rd. Super, super awesome. That signal is 6.23 and the rep is 2760. I'm super excited that you agreed to do this, and I think it should be a pretty interesting conversation.
Yeah, I'm super stoked. I'm happy that you asked me to.
Nice. So for people watching, you'll see my hand in there all the time. That's because my laptop has a webcam at the bottom, which is a giant pain. So I apologize for that. But nonetheless, Johnny, let's dive right into it. I usually start these pro tips by asking people how they got started. So what does your story look like?
So my story, like, it was more of an evolution than an instant like start. So I've been in security now for approximately 10 years. So I've jumped around to different areas of security. I've done incident response, forensics, worked in enterprise security, vuln management. I've kind of really just played the field when it comes to different types of aspects of security. And I think, what originally interested me in security was like the concept of hacking. I've always thought it was really cool to subvert systems and things like that. Um, that kind of probably started at a very early age. So my first computer was like a Windows 3 machine. I had like the Epson like dot matrix printer. I had no internet. Like internet existed for sure, but it
Yeah,
wasn't like very common. In fact, it was like super uncommon to have like computers in households.
right.
So like this isn't like a traditional hacking story, but this is like an example of subverting a system uh, by someone. So at the time, I got in trouble at school, right? And part of the punishments that we would get was like, oh, write 100 sentences.
Right.
So I said, hey, do you mind if I type 100 sentences? And right now we're like, oh, we're laughing because we're like, oh, 2018, we already know how this is going to go, right?
Yeah.
So at the time, though, like there wasn't very many computers in the households, at least like where I was from, and so the concept was novel. Like, oh, this student wants to type 100 sentences. So of course, we know now like this is the classic copy and paste sentence injection attack. So like the sentence was written once and then pasted like 100 times, and
Yeah.
and although that's not a traditional hacking thing, that's like the kind of the genesis of like using a computer for me. Like I think I was maybe like 8 or 9 or something
Okay.
to circumvent like a process, right?
Yeah.
Um, so that was probably like maybe the genesis, and then it evolved like after I first got the internet, trying different things with my friends, stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and then I led to a career in security. But I see like bug bounty as something that's like a little bit unique in its own. And what was unique to me about bug bounty and the genesis of that are a little different. So so for bug bounty, it's cool because you can attack other people's systems and you don't have to worry about getting in trouble and things like that. And that's something that I didn't grow up with. So whenever I had the opportunity to do that, of course, like I was immediately interested in it, right?
Yeah.
But there's actually a specific scenario that like kind of like got me to take it seriously and really jump in. And in that scenario was the first H1702. You were there, and a lot of other really great hackers were there. And when I showed up, I was super intimidated because these are guys I see on the leaderboard. I see bugs coming in from these guys. I know they're like the top talent on the HackerOne platform. So I walked in like very intimidated.
Yeah.
The event was like really hectic. There was a lot of reports flying at me. I was trying to triage all these reports. And so when I walked away, the next week back at work, Kevin Rowe actually wrote a blog post about his experience at that event.
Yeah.
And when I read his blog post about it, where he said, he had some of the same anxieties like walking into that room from his perspective,
Yes.
and he was so successful, I kind of, thought to myself like, oh man, like I didn't realize that they also were concerned about walking into the room with a lot of talent, and to me that was like really inspirational. So like we had a event where it was kind of a debrief during our engineering all hands, and I recommended that we invite Kevin to come talk about his bugs because I thought his story of turning from Uber driver to Uber hacker was really inspirational in its own.
Yeah.
So like when he came and talked and he was able to give like the background of his methodology and what he found, it really resonated with our engineers. And so like what I
Oh,
did at that point was I slapped an H1702 sticker like on the front of my laptop by my touchpad, and I said like I want to be invited next year, and I
yeah.
know the way to be invited is to produce like valuable bugs on the platform. So anytime I opened up my laptop, I saw that sticker and I knew like that was a goal of mine. And so instead of just like playing around on the internet, I had like kind of like a goal to shoot for, and it was a constant reminder. And that's how I started into bug bounty.
That's wild. Yeah. That's it's awesome to hear that, like the side of it from the triager's perspective, because I never thought of that. I 100% resonate with that, like the anxiety walking into it, and I think I've been to 3 or 4 of them now, and that anxiety for me at least doesn't go away. The first time I was walking into it was like the anxiety of like seeing all these other people, right? Who are like, just like you said, like they're just like kings on the leaderboard, right? Um, and like that kind of has dissipated. Like I'm comfortable with everybody. I kind of know people. I've talked to a lot of people, but I still have wicked anxiety walking in there and just wanting to produce.
Hmm.
For me, it's kind of like wanting to demonstrate like I've earned like the right to be here. Like I've earned my invitation. And truthfully, I don't think I've walked away from an event that HackerOne's put on when I've thought, yes, I have done that. Each time I kick myself in the ass. I'm curious, like turning it there. So you got invited to the next one, right? Which was San Francisco last year.
Right.
And so, like, how did that self challenge go? Did you find it successful seeing the sticker there all the time? And then what was it like at the event for you?
Yeah, the event for me was like super surreal. So my goal at the time was to be invited back to 702, which was like a year from like the previous event.
Hmm.
And so this was the first 4-on-5. So like I didn't even have the concept of like, oh, this may happen like more than once a year.
Right.
So it kind of like happened faster than I wanted it to, right? So like I felt like, oh, am I prepared to do this? And
Yeah.
so when I went in, at that event, we had like a bunch of different rooms and stuff
Yeah.
where a lot of us set up together. And my room, like, so we were starting doing like hacking events like in San Francisco where we would basically like meet up, and Justin Kalmus was kind of spearheading this at the time. And we would meet up and choose a program and we would all like hack together. And then in the
Huh.
room with me was a lot of the people that participated in the hack night. So like that
Yeah.
added like a level of comfort there because I've hacked a lot with these people before. And so like at first I didn't walk in with any bugs. So sometimes like you may have bugs that you're ready to like report. So I walked in with no bugs,
Yeah.
and I had done a bit of recon in advance because we known the targets a few days in advance. But I was like had a really hectic work week, so I couldn't spend as much time on it as I wanted.
Yeah.
So all I wanted was one bug. Like I needed a bug. Like once I got a bug
Yes.
that was going to help me in terms of like getting the process flowing. And so I was kind of like hitting both programs very sporadically, like looking at everything. And not until I finally like just said, okay, I'm going to focus on this one particular aspect,
Yeah.
that I start finding bugs. And then once, in my opinion, like when I'm at that event, once I get my first bug in, like I feel good. Like I've got something, I produced something. This is something that I think that the company might find valuable. It's something that I feel like I'm demonstrating like why I'm there, things like that. And so once I get the first bug, like it becomes much easier, I think.
Yeah. No, that's 100%. I remember going to San Francisco. Um, San Francisco was the one that I was first invited to. Like 702, I wasn't actually invited there. And it was actually Kevin Rowe that got me into it. Like he talked to Ted and was like, Ted, hey, Pete's in Vegas as well. Would it be okay if he came? So I think I came for like the second and third night. So for San Francisco was my first invite. And like my goal was just like find one bug, just find one
Right.
issue to report. And it was the same thing. I didn't have a lot of time going into it, and so I didn't spend much time on my recon. I didn't have bugs lined up, but and it's public knowledge now. Like Airbnb was the target there, and so I had been playing with them a lot. Um, and so like I just felt like I had worked the platform. Like I didn't know where else to look. I didn't know what else to do.
Mhm.
Um, and so like that was just like a higher level of anxiety. And then Shopify being the other program that was there. I was like, Shopify's a mature program. Like, what am I? I still had that like terrible view of myself. Was like, what am I going to find in Shopify if I sit down? Which is just like the worst mentality to have going into those.
Yeah, I agree. Those are both really tough programs, and I felt the same way, you know.
I'm curious the hacking event that you guys did, like with Kalmus leading that up. What did that look like? Sitting in a room with other people when you guys are going after targets together. Like, were you kind of like working independently, and if you found something, you would share it, or were you guys actually like sitting in front of the same computer going after stuff, like a paired programming type of approach?
It was so like it was a lot of people that either worked together currently or had previously worked with each other, and
Oh,
it kind of like over time started becoming more people coming,
okay.
and everyone was at different levels in terms of their exposure to bug bounty. So it was a lot of just like sitting around a room. We had like a Slack channel where we would share our IDs or our accounts. So
Okay.
if someone wanted something to kind of look for in terms of iDoors or something like that, they had the IDs of other participants that are working on it.
Right.
Sometimes someone would say like, "Hey, can I sit and just watch over your shoulder?" That happens sometimes as well. Or like, say maybe you may take the initiative and walk over and say, "Hey, is there anything I can help you with?" Stuff like that.
Oh, sweet.
Um, yeah, so it was kind of like it started out kind of at a coffee shop, and then after a couple of those meetups, we were doing it like in the boardroom of HackerOne.
Oh, nice. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Yeah, we started trying to do something like that at work now, where we do like lunchtime hacking. And it's usually we just grab like a box or like a CTF style, and we'll go after it. But I like that. That's really cool. So you haven't been on the other side of things very long doing bug bounties. I'm curious. I know for me, like when I looked back at my bugs, some of them are like super embarrassing. Has a lot changed for you in like that short, it'd probably be like what, like 18, 24 months now, since you've got into it?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I've got like plenty of embarrassing bugs. Well, some of them like specifically are things without POCs. So like I had a hunch
Okay.
that something's vulnerable, or I
Yep.
had something that was uh, maybe a best practice, or I had things that I would not consider reporting now.
Yeah.
But at the time, I was trying to search for like what programs cared about, like what are the thresholds that of issues that are important to them. I mean, I had kind of a conflicting thing is like if I see something, should I say something? But if it's not very impactful, like how does that play into my signal? And
Yeah.
signal is something that I took seriously like from the very beginning because during the 702 event, um, I think it was Ruby walked up to us and was talking about the importance of signal and things like that. And then I realized at that point that that's something that I want to maintain. So I
Yeah.
did measure thresholds, but I generally try to uh, not submit something that I think might be closed informative.
Yeah. I feel like I don't know. I guess I haven't been on HackerOne like a super long time, but I feel like that paradigm has shifted, right? Like there was that kind of at the beginning, at least when I was starting, I know I was super noisy, and it took me a long time to appreciate kind of what value Signal had. And I still think there are super noisy people, but I think there's a far better appreciation for what Signal is and what it represents, not only from like the value you provide to a company, but it's also like your reputation and bug bounty, what you're doing with these companies, and if you're trying to do this as a career, whether with a company or like as a full-time hunter, it makes a big difference when you're actually submitting value to a company as opposed to just throwing anything at a wall. Um, yeah, it's
Like that.
awesome. Um, so now, like when you sit down to hack, like what does that process look for you? Are you finding bugs kind of like immediately? Are you kind of digging in, trying to go deeper on a program, looking for like those more critical issues? What does a session of hacking look like for you?
Um, so it varies. So like in my day job, I have like a methodology that I follow for each like of the features I review,
Oh, sweet.
and at night, like when I'm like doing bug hunting, it's generally like my free time. So it's like for me to experiment a bit and to kind of try unique approaches. So sometimes I might try a certain way, and other times, I go for something completely different. But I would say, like for the most part, what I do when I sit down is I'll just go through and walk the app,
Okay.
just like go through all the features that I can, and I'll have accounts at different privilege levels. and maybe of different instances of the same product. And then I spend a lot of time in the history tab on
Okay.
Burp. So I'll filter for pieces of information that are unique about my user. Like I'm looking for my IDs and any requests they have,
Yeah.
things I've inputted like my email, stuff like that, because I want to know like what post requests or what gets are returning data about me or are modifying data about me. Then I'll generally like throw those up into repeater,
Hmm.
and then I'll start basically just trying to influence the response from the server. So I'm looking for like IDORs there. I'm looking for cross-site request forgery protections. I'm looking for input handling, what's reflecting. I'm going through things like that. I
Yeah.
also look through my history and I sort by like post requests or gets, and I start focusing on different methods. I'll look for like areas of the application that are very different from the rest of the app. So
Hmm.
say like you're normally making a post with a JSON body, but now you have this like multi-part form, for example.
Yeah.
I found that sometimes applications fall apart, like when at the seams when they're implementing something that's like a third-party module or something. So
Yeah.
I will reevaluate each of those posts and gets, for example, in a different way because I can't assume that these have the same protections as the other stuff.
Right. Right.
It's like
And
generally what you normally do.
no, it's you and I talked about this, I think, at the last HackerOne event, and I haven't heard too many people talking about it as well. But going through the history and just like grepping through like those key strings,
Oh yeah,
I found that successful as well. Especially when a site, a lot of times you'll have a site that'll like collect a whole bunch of personal information, and like there will be that disclaimer like we will never disclose this or anything like that. And
right,
if you
right.
work through the app, you play through everything, and then you grep for that, like sometimes you just see it being disclosed in a whole bunch of places that are like hidden fields or part of like an object return on a JSON response where it's not supposed to be there. And then sure enough, you submit that and you've got a vulnerability right there.
Oh, sure.
So it's interesting to hear you mention a similar approach to that. Um, the other thing on the note of that event, one of the things you introduced me to was the Burp plugin. I think it was Reflector, which will, in the background kind of submit some of the requests that you've made, where it identifies parameters, and we'll try to check to see how those are received. And you found a really cool bug at that event, and I've started using that since. So I'm curious, are you still using Reflector? Are there any other Burp plugins that help you with that methodology that you use?
Yeah, for sure. So like I love passive plugins. I think these are like give you free bugs. So like
Right.
as you're doing your manual hunting, you can go back to like your like scanner tab and it will show all the passive items that were found. And I like to sort them by severity.
Okay.
So I look at this as like free wins, right? So
Yeah.
like these are things that are going to be looking for stuff that maybe I maybe overlooked when I'm looking at things in repeater, or maybe something that I wouldn't normally like know of just off of like viewing it. So like Retire.js has like landed me a bunch of stuff because there's
Oh,
been a
really?
lot, yeah, a lot of out of date JavaScript that is like third party JavaScript includes things like that. And also the reflected plugin that you're referring to, that one has found a lot of stuff because basically what that will do is it'll look for reflection on the page and then it will try to put in like it just replays it with like without a payload, just like angle brackets or quotes, and it'll tell you like these special characters are also being reflected, and that's like generally how I manually would approach it anyway. Like I won't drop straight in like some sort of payload if it's like cross-site scripting. I'll start out by just doing like the brackets or the quotes. So
Yeah.
it's really just like automating that for me.
It's smart. At least for me, like I find like the cross-site scripting tends to pay the bills, right? Like it's just so prevalent everywhere. It's not hard to find, which I always thought would be impossible kind of at the beginning. But it almost gets like repetitive, boring, and mundane, right? And so
Yeah.
the opportunity to take that and just give it to a plugin so that it can just passively start looking for reflective stuff, like it's almost like for me, like stored cross-site scripting has gotten boring. Um, but then like reflective is like a new level of boring. And so like when you can find a plugin, that's why when you shared that plugin with me, I was like, this is awesome. I'm actually going to use this. And I got that set up right away. Um, so thank you for that. And
Oh, for sure.
other people, I'm sure, hopefully they try it out and use that as well. So we've talked about some of the bugs being embarrassing for both you and I in our history. I'm curious, is there anything that stands out in your mind as like one of the most impressive creative bugs that you can share?
Oh yeah, for sure. So this particular bug, I kind of like went out on a limb and I downloaded, like a desktop application, and I was looking for issues with the desktop app. So it
Okay.
was a little bit different from the standard like mobile app or web app like approach.
Yeah.
So for me, like I was already out there like on a limb. That's not something that I normally do. Um, so luckily, when I installed this application, I noticed that in the background, it was setting up a web server on my local
Oh,
host. So it wasn't apparent to the user, but
yeah.
it actually was doing this in the background. So I
Huh.
was like, okay, score, this is a web app pen test, but I have it running on my machine.
Yeah.
So that was like, so when I saw that, I started looking at it and I noticed like, okay, so it's not opening any ports to the world, but it's running under localhost. And when I was looking at the requests and responses, I noticed that there was no protections for, well, there's no concept of a session
Mm.
because the developer assumed like, oh, this is on someone's machine. They shouldn't have to worry about sessions, stuff like that.
Yeah.
There was also no concept of cross-site request forgery prevention as well. And there was no concept, or they also had wide open cores, so reflect any origin.
Mm.
So for me, I'm like, oh wow, like I can create like a malicious page and just raid this local app.
Yeah.
So I looked through the local, well, I started looking at all the request responses like how I look at a normal web app, and I found one that was actually vulnerable to code injection. So I was like, oh snap, I'm going to have like cross-site request forgery to code injection on someone's like laptop. And and then that was like at that point like I was like, okay, this is kind of interesting because I'm like reaching into their machine and then going back into it through the browser and getting code execution. So then I was like looking at this local web server and I realized it ran on a random port. So I was like, how am I going to know which port this application is running on? So I started building my POC, and at this point, it's like a halfway bug.
Yeah.
And so in my POC, there was a little like text box for you to put in what port you're running, and then you could put like what application you want to open and hit go, and my website would open the app. And I was like, this is kind of lame.
Yeah.
Uh, it's definitely like a real bug, but it's not like weaponized. So I remembered there was something called like JS Recon.
Okay.
It's basically like JavaScript that can run in your browser that can scan like your internal network. And I was like, wow, why don't I use JS Recon to find the port that this is running on? And as I was playing with it, I realized, okay, sure, it's a random port, but it was within a range of like 1,000 ports.
Mm.
So it's amazing how fast JavaScript can hit 1,000 ports. So what I did is I built like I looked at JS Recon, which you can find an example of it online, and I pulled out the parts that were interesting for this POC. So I basically built this POC that would scan this local host for the ports, and it would send my payloads to this local web server to get code execution. So what I did and the end is like you click on my link if you had this application installed and your webcam came on, which I thought was like an impactful, like very clear. You're looking at yourself right now. uh, so I like that bug because it was a journey. It wasn't like straightforward. It took a lot of steps, and it took a little bit of me stepping outside my comfort zone and taking like a step back and thinking of how can I like address this.
Yeah, that's amazing. I thought for sure when you said like you didn't know what port it was going to be like because Chorus was open, you hit another endpoint, and it was like boom, here's all the information about like what's going on with the server. But it's even cooler that you found like the JavaScript that would go ahead and scan a bunch of stuff. That's awesome. I'm really curious. Like how did you realize that it opened up a web server on your computer when you were running it? Like what tipped you off to that?
So I was so like this plugin has some functionality that also interacts with the website. So the website can actually you can hit things like in your browser and it would kick off jobs in this plugin. And I realized that this was going through my burp and it was hitting a subdomain of that site. And I was like, okay, so this is a subdomain of the site that I'm testing.
Yeah.
And then I started looking at that after I was looking at the main API, and I was like, whoa, this looks like my computer. And I looked to see like what that subdomain resolved to, and it was 127.0.0.1. I was like, oh wow, this is in my computer.
Yeah. Okay,
And then
that's
after that, it was just like, okay, so I pulled a lot of bugs out of that, but my favorite was the cross-site cross forgery to command injection. And since then, I've actually found another scenario where that worked as well, which is just it's just to me it's weird, but
yeah,
it's
no, absolutely. Man, that's awesome. Thanks a lot for sharing that. Yeah, it's to be honest, like when I've seen desktop stuff go in scope, I just kind of like always taking the approach like I don't have a lot of time. There's a lot of competing programs that are offering me opportunities, and so I just kind of shy away from that. But as I've been thinking and stepping back and being like, where can I dig in deeper on some programs that I like? Some of them have desktop applications,
mhm.
and I've it's always been in the back of my mind to just go check them out and see what's going on and test things. But hearing this, I'm definitely just going to open them up just to see what's happening because you never know how people code things.
Oh, for
Um,
sure. You never know what that app's going to be.
Especially with Electron being so popular now as well. You keep seeing Electron vulnerabilities being popped up. And anytime you get like a remote code execution on like the Electron desktop app, it's
Mhm.
like remote code execution against somebody's laptop, which is kind of cool. I love the
Yeah.
POC. So I wanted to take an opportunity here a little bit because you and I are both on triage teams,
Mhm.
and so you've touched on it a little bit. Um, But I'm curious for you, like just cutting to the chase, what's been the biggest takeaway for you as a hacker being on the other side of a triage bug?
Yeah, so there's like tons of learning opportunities like being on the triage side. Not only like, looking at the bugs that are coming in, but also knowing like the internal process of like how bugs actually traverse the system to get fixed and get rewarded and paid out.
Yeah,
I would say like one really key takeaway is like how to write a report. So when you write your reports, like when a triager has a lot of bugs coming in, sometimes they're going to pick the reports to jump on first that are easy to repro and they can get through and
yeah,
the impact's like super clear. Sometimes you open up a report and it's just a wall of like words and it's just like you're frantically trying to find like what's important in this report. And there's just a lot of like stuff like wrapped around it, whether it be like unnecessary information or say like FUD. There's a lot of people who like overhype their bugs, things like that. So and it's hard to kind of cut through all that and look directly like at the bugs. So I would say like have like a really succinct report, have like really easy repro steps, like have your POC ready to go, have it like something that someone can clearly like repro, have the impact super clear. Having the impact super clear helps when it's time to discuss with the company about the reward for
yeah.
the bug because without like clear impact, it's hard for a triager to like really like fight for the reward when the impact is like really spelled out in a way that can be distilled to who may be deciding that reward. Um, that can help. And also like if you have a sense of like how to fix the bug, I always try to throw that in as well because
Mm.
that helps it resolve quicker and that makes the whole process go smoother. Um, so that's like one key takeaway for sure.
It's interesting you mentioned that because I almost want to just like hammer that home. Like it's the exact same thing triaging at Shopify. Like the amount of reports that we get that are like critical, your entire site is vulnerable to something that we mark as NA is just like unreal. Um, So having that like just realistic expectation of kind of like what this true impact is across like a broader platform of what's going on is huge for people that report to us. And then like, being on both sides, I've come to appreciate like white space, right, and headers. It's not that I try to make like my report like full of headers, but I try to like easily have like a flow in terms of like here's a quick description, here's how I found this, here's how you can just easily reproduce it, and then here's what I think is impact, right? And the impact stuff, the one thing that I would add, I would again put the stamp on what you said. You don't have to explain what cross-site scripting is to us. Like
Right. Oh,
we
for sure.
understand that, but if you can identify like you're disclosing this information, but you didn't say you would here, and then like I don't necessarily know every single application that Shopify releases. So if you've done this homework, it makes it a lot easier for me to triage it and then get that moving along so that we can do something else and
Oh,
get
for
you
sure.
paid. Yeah.
And the concept of like impact, sometimes impact is not like immediately clear. So like one of the things I look for, say for example, in a subdomain takeover is like, what is the impact of this? So like to
Yeah.
some people, it might seem like, oh, it's a defacement. However,
Yeah.
it could be much more. So like if you have your cookie scoped in a way that it's being passed to the subdomain, you could grab cookies. You could do things like pass cores whitelists.
Yeah.
There are other whitelists you can pass with that. There's like all kinds of things, and if you can enumerate that, it will help with the impact as opposed to, um, not giving all those details.
Yeah, it's a super huge point. And Arnie Swindon was the first one that introduced that to me in Hacking Pro Tips, where he was talking about like cookie scoped in the entire domain. And so for people that are kind of not familiar with that, the idea being like if you have foo.bar.com and you can take over foo, but then like the core site being bar.com, if a cookie from that domain is set to all subdomains, when you take over foo, you then take over the account across the parent domain, which is makes it a whole bunch more impactful than just say grabbing a subdomain that nobody really cares about and they just take it down right away.
For sure.
So yeah, no, that's I'm glad you referenced that. It's interesting to hear things resonate across different programs when you're doing things. So um, you worked at a company who participated in H1715, so you had some big names reporting bugs to you. What was that like? What was that like reading reports from people who you saw on the big leaderboards?
Yeah. So like when I was triaging for that event, obviously there's like a lot of like really great talent there. Um, I would say that, and even prior to the event, the program was trying to reach out, to people and trying to engage a lot, like on the program. So like we had a lot of engagement from a lot of people that are like top on the leaderboard. I would say that like triaging for those people, I learned a lot. So for example, when we're triaging for stuff for like Litchfield or Franz or Yobert and all these guys, like you're introduced to a lot of different types of bugs,
Mm-hmm.
and it was really great for me like in my development because as I'm like introduced to something, I could ask help, like if I'm trying to repro things like that, and I would kind of grasp it at a much like deeper level, and I would say that like that's one of the biggest takeaways from like triaging from a program with a lot of people submitting is you do learn a lot of stuff for sure.
Yeah, it tends to be a hot topic of conversation with people thinking that, methodologies are stolen and, information and knowledge is, walked away with and people triaging or, stealing, stealing bugs and reporting them elsewhere. But I've had the same thing, right? In Shopify, we go out of our way to try to disclose things so people can see what we're getting. Um, but it's just like there's a lot to learn there, and it's not necessarily like I haven't come across anything looking at all the Shopify bugs and even the ones that are like have not been disclosed, where it's like this was earth shattering. I never had any like purview into this. I'm sure those bug classes exist, but in my mind, it's like everything eventually comes out. Um,
Oh yeah.
so yeah, it's been interesting reading people's like reports and seeing kind of what people are focusing on. One of the key things that I saw, like reading some of the reports that were reported to Shopify, was like I had this perception that everyone was just going out there and submitting like remote code executions, and that's what was happening. Um, but it's not necessarily always the case, right? Like there's a wide spectrum of bugs that are being reported, and it really depends on what people's motivations are.
Oh, for sure. And yeah, like I mean, I would say that I did learn a lot triaging for sure, but methodologies don't really come through super well in reports. It's not like it's like I never learned like how people discovered things, but I would learn more about particular bugs, things like that for sure.
I just watched a conference talk, and I think it was ShmooCon, and I can't remember the name of the person that presented, but anyways, it was really interesting because one of the things she talked about was taking CVEs, and so getting like a proof of, not a proof of concept, but like a fix for a CVE, deconstructing that yourself, and then figuring out, okay, what did this look like before this was patched? And how would I have gone and found that? So it's almost like you read the CVE, then you go to the application, you set it up locally, and then you try to attack the application and find where that vulnerability is, and then exploit it, and then go back to the CVE code and see how they patched it and understand it from that way. And
Oh, for sure.
I've always taken bug reports kind of that way and not actually like consciously thought about it, but gone after it in terms of like, how did this person find this? What were they searching for? How do they submit this payload? And I've done it less as I've gotten busier, but I want to get back to it because I found it super, super helpful in deconstructing that kind of stuff. So it's almost like you don't need the methodology because you can develop that like creativity yourself,
Oh,
and
for
it's almost
sure.
better.
Yeah, and everyone has their own different methodology that works well for them, and it's tough to try to, suggest methodology to someone else. It's not even yourself. So if I were like to recommend to someone this is how you should do it,
Yeah.
um, you know, they may have a completely different perspective. It's very unique between individuals.
So, talking about employment, you mentioned working with Justin Kalmus, and so I've gotten the notes here in brackets. Okay, hacker, perhaps mediocre at best. But seriously, like in the conversations that I've had with him, I've learned a ton, and I'm curious, what's it like to work not only with him but other people who are perhaps smarter than you? You have a lot to learn from. Like, what's the value for you in being in a place like that where you're working with other smart people as opposed to say doing bug hunting full time by yourself?
You absorb a lot from like your other coworkers for sure. Um, Justin specifically, I worked with him at two different organizations, so I had opportunity to work with him a lot, and he's like definitely like inspired me and encouraged me to like learn more and to go out there and to become more involved in stuff. So I would say that like working with talented individuals definitely rubs off on you because you pick up a lot from them. It's pretty inspiring. So like if you think about like um, when you say like, so what's your methodology like? Like, would you just jump into a program to look for a specific bug, or how do you canvas the app? Sometimes like something someone says at work or something that's discovered at work, like kind of like ignites like, oh, I'm going to look for this like everywhere because this is a super interesting bug, and I wouldn't have thought about it if the person sitting beside me wasn't like an AWS expert, for example.
Yeah.
Um, I, I I learn a lot from my coworkers that way for sure.
Yeah, it's like just to echo that, like it's the exact same thing working at Shopify. Like I had a coworker, Jen, who was at H1 415, and she found just a wicked internal bug, and I was just like okay, you need to sit down and explain to me like what made you think of that, how you found that, and then like what steps you took to make sure that we weren't vulnerable anywhere. And it's the same thing for like the mobile experts that we have. Like two of them on the team are just amazing, and I learned a ton from them.
Oh,
Um, I'm going to do like a debrief. So we were doing the side note, like the H1 CTF, and just anyways. But they were like they walked through a couple different bugs, and I'm going to get like sit down and do the debrief because I started trying to figure out how Smalley worked and all that kind of thing. Like that was a big takeaway from me. But like Ivan went through and looked at all of the encryption stuff, and so like he's just like in and out in crypto, loves it. So it's an opportunity to learn that from him. And then Christina did like all the like Frida stuff, or Hopper, and looking at stuff dynamically, and then like deconstructing that, of which I have no skill on either side. So opportunities to work with other teams in my mind are huge. It's cool to hear you say the same thing, and hear similar stories of learning from coworkers.
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes it happens organically, and if an organization doesn't do this, like I recommend also uh, creating time for people to share their skill set with other team members through like cross training or just just setting aside that time to say like, hey, I'm going to take this time and introduce you to something that I know very well or something. So
Absolutely. That's awesome that you guys do that as well. So on that note, people who listen to this become inspired, want to follow a similar path. You've been at a couple different companies that seem to have different sizes. Um, what's been your takeaway from that? Like if someone were to look for a similar job, what would your advice be to them?
um, so like each environment you work in is going to be different and unique. So like say for example, Salesforce is a very large company, very mature. They've been around for a long time. I think like when I was there, they were celebrating like their 15th anniversary. That's quite a long time for like a software company.
Yeah.
Um, so they had like a very large security team. So they had like over 100 people, and there's a lot of different skill sets that come into play when you work in a team that large. So like what's really great for working for a large company like that is like you have the opportunity to work with experts in very specific fields, and you may be able to collaborate with them in a way where it may rub off. So like
Yeah.
that's like a big takeaway from that. Um, Also, just to counter that is like when you work for a large company, like you may have a small subset that you're responsible for as well. So you may not have much exposure to what's happening like in incident response teams, or may not have much exposure to what's happening in the product if you're working on enterprise security, for example. So so while the skill set is there, your particular role may not have like any sort of play into like things that are like much out of your reach, right?
Right.
When you work at like a smaller startup, it's a very different scenario. So like, say for example at Zenefits, like we all came in, we were like started a security team from scratch. So
Oh,
we had an
really?
opportunity to like spin up the entire security program. And what was great about that is like everything that you do has like a real solid impact, and it's like becoming like part of like the way this company operates. And there's a lot of like cross collaboration because you're sitting in a small like cube, and you can just like you know talk over the wall and collaborate on ideas. So the collaboration in terms of like subsets of security is much higher because you the whole team is right there.
Yeah.
So it really just depends on what you want and like where you're at in your career. I'd say that there's an advantage in both of those scenarios.
That's awesome. That's really cool. I didn't realize that you guys were doing that when you had Zenefits. It's awesome on so many levels, right? Because you're actually seeing like real tangible effects, right? Not that you don't see that at a bigger company, but
Mhm.
it's almost like because you have so many other people, like there's the opportunity like for diminishing returns, right? Like you might not have as key an impact. So it's interesting to see that. It's Shopify. I feel like Shopify is at like a middle ground right now, where we have dedicated teams, and there's an opportunity to learn like just like the talent level there is insane. So you're learning just a ton.
Mhm.
But there's the opportunity for input, and because there are a number of channels that everyone's in, we're all dispersed geographically, but it's like the conversations all kind of come back there, and so you have that. That's cool. Thanks a lot for sharing that. Hopefully, if people have questions, I mean, I'm happy to answer them. But I'm sure, I mean,
All the same.
yeah, cool. Um, in terms of knowledge, we talked about kind of working with others, like doing hacking together, but then also like learning from teams, other smart people that you're around. The events have been awesome. Are there other ways that you specifically search out new forms of knowledge in hacking?
Oh yeah, for sure. So I read like public disclosures, for example.
Yeah.
I read like Reddit and NetSec.
Yep.
I talk to peers and chat about things that we're working on. Um, I do trainings, so I've had an opportunity to take a lot of different trainings.
Which
Um,
trainings have you done?
so I've done a lot of the Black Hat courses that are offered.
Oh,
So
nice.
I've done the Offensive Security web app course, which is like one of my favorite courses that I've taken.
Yeah.
Um, Luca from Doyensec has a really awesome Burp plugin course that he
Really?
gave a coworker and myself. And I don't know, there's just a gang of them that I've taken. Like if I looked at the list, I could go through them. But since some SensePost courses, some SANS courses, and outside of security, I sign up for like just development courses as well. So like Team Treehouse, Udemy, things like that.
Oh, nice.
That may not specifically be clear like in terms of security, but I'm learning this like from a security perspective to kind of
Yeah.
expand my knowledge in each individual
I need to do the same thing. So I've started. I think this will be the first time I take like a dedicated training course with Mario Hendrick. I can't wait for it at NorthSec this first year from Cure 53. I think it's going to be amazing. But then I used to do like a lot of online trainings and stuff for programming and whatnot, and I found them like hugely invaluable.
Oh, for
And
sure.
I feel like now I'm at a point where I'm like starting to forget all that stuff or just like constantly becoming reliant on like Stack Overflow for things. Um, so it's cool to hear you say that you're kind of doing that as well. because I've always just had it sit in the back of my mind whether or not it would be valuable. But other people have said the same thing, and so to hear it again, I'll probably end up doing the same. So if there are other people listening as well, Coursera, Udemy, there's another one as well. I'm losing off the top of my head, but there's a few kind of like those online like MOOC styles where you can just go and learn.
Oh,
Um,
for sure. And I saw the course that you're taking by Mario. I'm like, that's a course I really want to take as well. It looks very interesting.
Come to NorthSec.
I know, I'd love to, man.
Apparently, it's free beer during the entire conference in the
What?
CTF. Yeah, yep. And the
That sounds
CTF is apparently unreal. So I'm really looking forward to that. I've never been there before. It'll be cool. And there's a lot of Canadian hackers that are coming up on HackerOne.
oh,
So they'll be there as well. So it'll be a cool community thing as well.
very
Is there
awesome.
anything you wish you knew more about with hacking? Like, is there any specific area you want to focus on to develop skills on?
Yeah, so like right now I'm spending a lot more time doing code reviews. So that's like part
Oh,
of
okay.
like these development training courses and things like that, is to be more comfortable just going through code and picking bugs out there.
Yeah.
Um, so that's something that I'm focusing my time on now. Um, of course, like I would love to do more like uh, desktop type applications, things like that. That's something that I haven't spent much time on. I'd like to spend more time there as well.
How does the code review stuff look like for you now? Like, do you feel like you're starting to get it, or are you just kind of like starting to dive into that? Like, is it starting to resonate for you?
Yeah, it's definitely starting to resonate, but there's always areas for improvement, and that's one of the things that I'm looking to improve is like the efficiency of it, because sometimes it can be like a long task, and just knowing very clearly where to jump to and where to look for bugs, things like that. I want to improve the efficiency of the code review.
Yeah, that from what I started. There's this giant textbook on like code review. My brother picked it up for me. Like somebody was throwing it out at university. Um, and as I started reading through it, like it was very focused on like low-level memory management and whatnot. So it's interesting to look at that and then compare like reviewing like say Ruby apps, but then also kind of what's going on in like Golang. And
Mhm.
so I think when you start taking all of that and then you look at open source projects like that are in different bug bounties or companies that just put all their stuff out there, there's a lot of value both in being in an employment perspective doing that, but then also like taking those skills and just expanding upon them. And it's almost like no single language is the same, right? The framework is the same. So cool. Uh, that's awesome to hear. I'd be really interested to follow up with you and see how that went, and what some of those resources were and if they were successful.
Oh, for sure.
So last question, and I tend to ask this to everybody, but do you have any specific advice for people that are new to hacking, new to bug bounties?
Yeah, for sure. I would say like don't overwhelm yourself. Don't think that you need to know like every type of bug and just have like a full library of things like in your methodology. I would say like start out like just learning one bug and learning it well, and just expanding past that. So like after you feel like you've got one bug really well, like move on to the next. A good bug to start with, I think, is IDORs, because it's something that like as you're walking through an application, they become apparent like very quickly. So
Hmm.
I would say that's something that could be a good place to start. Or say, for example, you want to start just like learning the ins and outs of like just like cross-site scripting or cross-site request forgery, stuff like that. Just pick one bug and kind of like get to know it very well. If you're feeling frustrated about trying to like pull in all the phone classes at once. Um,
I think, yeah, I echo that. I'm glad you raised it because I do talk to a number of people who kind of reach out to me and kind of like I thought I would dive into this and I'd be finding everything, but it just seems like there's just a wealth of information. I don't know where to start. And I had that problem at the beginning where I was like trying to find everything, trying to uh, be, like not necessarily master of anything, but have familiarity with everything. And I found it hard at the beginning. And even like IDORs and cross-site scriptings, like I knew about them, I knew the concept of them, but I couldn't sit down and explain them to you in plain language. And it wasn't until much later that I got to that point that I started successfully finding them once I could understand that.
mhm.
So I would echo the advice, and hopefully people they find that useful. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
I guess on that note, that was the last question. I just want to thank you on behalf of everybody that listens and watches this. Again, just like others before you, this is an hour of your time that you've taken out to sit down with me on a Sunday afternoon to answer these questions and help others. So thanks very much on behalf of everybody. Really appreciate you taking the time to do it.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate you asking me to, for sure.
Sweet. All right, Johnny. That brings us to the end of the interview. So thanks very much, and have a good Sunday.
Oh, thank you. You too.
So, Johnny and I just concluded our interview, but we realized in the pre-chat that we had some really cool commonalities in terms of how we got into employment. So I've re-hit the record button here so that Johnny, I can ask you the question specifically of, and actually before I ask you the question, I wanted to flag this. So, if you look at your LinkedIn, it's not hidden that you're at Tinder now.
Hmm.
And a report's come up recently that Tinder is running a program. I remember looking at Tinder's program and seeing your name on there, and I was like, "Man, Johnny, like you can't report bugs to your own platform. Like this is ridiculous. Get off here. Get your points out of here." But in prepping for this, that's not the case, is it at all?
Oh, no. So, I was interested in living in Los Angeles, and I was talking to my boss at the time, Justin, and he was suggesting to me that I submit bugs to programs that are in Los Angeles. So when I got invited to the program, I was super excited because I was like, wow, this is like one of the LA-based companies that I'll be very interested in working for. So I basically was hoping that over like a period of time they would take notice of me as I was submitting to their program. And again, like a lot of other things, it happened like much quicker than I expected. So that kind of transitioned to like full-time employment, and that's like another great side effect of bug bounty is you get introduced to security teams of like all these companies, and you form relationships with them. So like a lot of these companies that I report to now, I know the people on the other end like on a personal level. Like I've gone out to grab lunch with them, or I've seen them at conferences, and I've met so many people through it, and a lot of job opportunities have come up like as a result of it. And specifically, like if you look at some job postings now, they'll say like under their bonus points section, active participant in bug bounties or active in the HackerOne community. So if you look at like, for example, Salesforce job postings now for the ProdSec, this is like one of their
Oh, really?
recommended like bonus points. Same thing with Postmates. They have an application security opening now, and they say specifically bonus points active in HackerOne community. So I just wanted to comment on like how you can transition like bug hunting into like full-time employment at some of these companies if this is something that you're interested in.
So, so when I joined Shopify, my original goal was so I started doing bug bounties, and they were all in my free time, and then I got my first security gig with the Ontario government as a pen tester. And so I started that in January, and then HackerOne was like, "Hey, we're having the hacker event come out in February." So I did that, and I was out at the hacking event. And my goal was be at the Ontario government for 2 or 3 years, do pen testing, learn it, do this day in, day out, develop the skill set where then I can apply to a company like Shopify.
Hmm.
And so when I got to 415, I found out it was Shopify. And I was like, this is awesome, but at the same time, it's just the wrong timing. Like I really just want to go find bugs on these guys and eventually prove to them that I can do this. And then I
Right.
will use that as like my application. But I didn't. But it just so happened that after we had the event, there was the dinner. And so I
Oh,
grabbed
yeah.
my food and I walked around the table and I sat down. I didn't know, I just saw Mark and his wife there. So I sat with Litchfield. And it turned out that I was sitting beside the Shopify security team. And so one of the women that was there, she kind of turned over and kind of like asked me my story and kind of what was going on. And I told her, from Canada and this kind of thing. And she asked where I was working. And it turned out Danae, who I was talking to, was one of the recruiters that worked specifically for the security team at Shopify.
Right.
And she asked me point blank, it was like, why didn't you apply to Shopify when you were looking for a job? And I was like, I didn't know that I could. And so she was like, okay, well, let's have a conversation. And so it was from there, just one thing after another. And it was purely because of bug bounties,
Yeah.
getting to go to the event and meeting the team that did it. So when you told me that story, I was like, oh man, this is amazing. It's like, this is what happens.
Oh, for sure.
I think I can name a few other people like off the top of my head. I won't put them on the spot because we haven't done interviews with them. Um, but people who have gone out and gotten job opportunities out of this.
Yeah.
So
Uh,
when you did this with Tinder, um, like what did that? Were you submitting just a ton of bugs and then put forward your application? Like how did that relationship like develop out of that?
so essentially, like the way that it worked is like again, like it wasn't something that I was prepared for. I was starting on a certain date, and I had a goal of like the following summer to apply for more work. But I was, just starting bug hunting at the time, and I was, and I just wasn't quite ready, to look for new work. But
Yeah.
I wanted to get my name out there, and so what happened was when I dropped in that program, of course, I was very interested, so I started submitting a lot of bugs, and so it turned into like, hey, if you're ever in LA, you should meet us for lunch. We'd love to like have lunch with you. And then it just so happened that there was a job opening there as well at that time. So a recruiter actually reached out to me, and I was like, hey, I know some of your team members. Yeah, I would definitely be excited to come down and interview with you guys. And it's kind of a great feeling when you interview with someone that you're already familiar with their product, because during the interview you can speak to it, and they know your familiarity because they know like the value you've provided so far. So it kind of cuts a lot of the part of the interview away where you have to like go through and just kind of prove yourself. You're not a stranger at that point. Like they know you, and I think a lot of companies are looking at the bounty space and recognizing the talent that's there, and are putting little things like this as bonus points in their job postings and stuff, because they realize that people that are out there in their free time working on bounties and stuff, these are people that are interested in learning and growing. So like as an example of that, Uranium Hacker, he's going to come on at Tinder this summer as an intern, and I've met him through the bug bounty community as well, and that's
Nice.
kind of how like we wanted to bring someone on, and I was like, hey, what about this guy? He's like really like doing some really great stuff right now, and he came in to interview, and it's similar like the bug bounty connection for jobs and stuff. It's real. So
Yeah, and honestly, it goes back. There's so many things going through my mind right now because all of what you said completely resonates with how I got onto Shopify, right? Like, um, the fact that I didn't find, I made a lot of noise on the platform, truthfully, when I first started on HackerOne, for Shopify. Um, and then, once I settled down, I kind of knew what I was doing. I had gone through their application. I wasn't able to find anything, but I knew the application.
oh right.
And so when I sat down in that interview, I could confidently talk about it. And like until this point right now, I didn't put two and two together, right? But it made for such a better conversation with the
Oh
security team because exactly what you said, I knew what I was talking about.
yeah.
The other thing, like for us, like one of the things that we hire for is passion. And so just like you mentioned, like the fact that I was doing this after hours was something that they hugely valued because it showed that I was passionate about this, willing to invest in myself, learn more, and so as a result, grow as a person. And so like that's the type of skill set that companies want to hire for, right? They don't want somebody just to kind of come in and 9 to 5 and then punch out and not have any self-interest in
Right,
development.
sure.
Um,
Because you want to
that's
work with people that are charged because you want to get excited off of their excitement. So when you're building a team, you want people who are very passionate about what they do, because that makes for a better environment for everyone for sure.
Yeah, no, definitely. Um, Man, that's awesome, and it's awesome to hear about uranium. The other thing I was going to mention was throwing it back to what you said about Signal, right? Like, Signal is about your reputation in the community, but with bug bounties becoming like a business card, your
Right.
signal is going to like your stats are going to walk into that room before you walk into the room.
Oh, for sure.
Um, so you need to guard that all around because you just never know what's going to be around that corner, right? Like employment opportunities abound.
Yeah, totally agree. For sure.
Cool. Okay. So again, Johnny, I think you and I this will be the second sign off. But before I do that, any closing words, anything that you wanted to address that we missed in terms of asking questions or anything like that?
No, specifically, I just wanted to talk about, the correlation between, work in bounty space and working for tech companies themselves. But no, I'm just really excited to have this opportunity to chat with you, and I'm stoked that you asked me to.
Nice. Thanks a lot, Johnny. Again, for the interview itself, but then also, like, as soon as we stopped, it was like, hey, Pete, we should have talked about this. We talked about wanting to cover it. And I'm so glad we did. I think there's like that last piece that we recorded. There's a huge amount of information there, especially for people that want to get into this space. And I get pinged from people all the time. So hopefully, if you take nothing else from this interview, just knowing that two people got into their employment opportunities right now purely from bug bounties, and there's probably an army of other people standing beside us that um, maybe it's not our place to name them, but you can. They're definitely out there. I know another person that's supposed to be joining Uber's team that did it from bug bounties as well. So, anyways, Johnny, thanks very much again for the interview, and have a good night.
You too.